Today, we are talking about narratives and climate policy and how that matters. Because a lot of climate policy debates are not only about the climate policy itself, but also about other dimensions, like the economy. And for example, is climate policy good for the environment, but costly for the economy? Is it unrelated, or is it good for both? And that topic is the starting point of today's paper, Narrative Entanglement, by Adam Brzezinski and Luis Garicano. Because the paper studies how politicians, when discussing climate policy, often bring in other dimensions into the discussion. And we will see why that matters. And I also really like the data analysis in this paper, because the authors use large language models to classify political speeches in European Parliament along several dimensions. And then as a case study, they analyze how Russia's invasion of Ukraine affected climate policy narratives and voting. So to discuss this paper, I am delighted to be joined by Dr. Adam Brzezinski. And Adam is a British Academy postdoctoral fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He completed his doctoral studies in economics at the University of Oxford in 2023, and he researches how narratives shape economic policy, how you can measure political narratives, and more broadly, how politics and the economy interact with each other. So, Adam, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure.
And I already had Luis on here. We kind of talked about the evolutions in climate policy and so forth, and then he was saying, we're actually analyzing this in a new paper. So, what's the paper about that you're writing?
Thanks. So the paper that we are writing is about what we call narrative entanglement, which describes the tendency of politicians to intertwine in narratives on different policy effects, even if these policy effects are factually separate. So I can give you an example using climate policy, since that's the topic of the podcast, but it's more general than that. But so take climate policy. Climate policy has many different policy effects. Most obviously, it has an environmental effect. Let's say, for instance, building a wind farm will reduce CO2 emissions by so and so many thousands of tons of CO2. So that's an environmental effect. But climate policy, of course, also has economic effects. For instance, climate policy needs an upfront investment in green technologies, which might be costly if there are subsidies for it. It will then affect, of course, the energy prices, and it'll also affect other things like house prices and jobs, etc. Now, factually, these two dimensions are separate. The economic effects of climate policy are driven by economic factors like market conditions, current gas prices, etc. The environmental effects of climate policy are in turn shaped by the laws of physics. So if we build one more windmill, it will reduce CO2 emissions by so and so much. So in principle, these two effects are completely factually different. But in practice, what we observe is this thing that we call narrative entanglement, which is that politicians intertwine their economic narratives and their environmental narratives. So they tend to say that climate policy is great for the environment and also will help the economy a lot. That's one kind of entangled narrative. Or they use the opposite entangled narrative, that climate policy is not needed for the environment and also will be economically devastating. So that's one aspect of narrative entanglement. Another slightly more subtle aspect of narrative entanglement is that because these two dimensions are entangled, when politicians change their story about, let's say, environmental effects, they will also feel pressure to change their story about the economic effects of climate policy. So one moves with the other, even when they are factually separate.
And one thing I think is, I don't know if this makes sense, but you would have like broad narrative entanglement where, I don't know if, this is my own hallucination, is, climate policy will create more jobs and more economic growth, all these like big economic things, versus small narrative entangle would be, well, we've got the EU ETS, we've got a price on carbon. So, well, that will change the electricity price a little bit because now we've got a tax.
Yes, absolutely. Climate's or entanglement more generally, not just on climate policy, can operate on very different levels. And we see this in the speeches that we analyze. I'm sure we'll get into that later. But you have the very broad statements like, about the European Green Deal, which we look at, which is, the European Green Deal will be great for an environment and it'll create huge amounts of new jobs. So that's a really broad one, right? But you can also see speeches which criticize particular measures, and again in an entangled way very often. So they say, well, this won't help the environment anyway, and it'll be disastrous for jobs or for prices or what have you.
And one of the questions then people might have is like, why do we care per se about the narrative entanglement? Like,
yes, I think that's absolutely crucial. So I think we care about narrative entanglement for two reasons. One is that it matters in and of itself, and the other is that it matters for policy. Let me start with the latter one. So in our paper, we discuss, and we have a formal model of this as well, but we discuss how narratives and policy are jointly determined. So politicians don't only have a policy position on climate policy, but they also have narratives that support that policy, right? So they'll have economic narratives and environmental narratives and many other dimensions as well, but let's stick with those two dimensions. Yeah. So they will say, for instance, I support climate policy, and I do this because climate policy is really important for the environment, and also it might be economically costly, but it is really important to do it because it is so crucial for the environment. So that would be a non-entangled narrative, right? But we show that in a sort of framework where you think about political competition between politicians, these politicians will actually have political pressure, to hide trade-offs under specific conditions, which we can discuss in a moment. But politicians, if they have pressure to hide policy trade-offs, they will not say the narrative that I just gave you, which is, I'm in favor of climate policy because it's great, it's really important to save the environment, even if it might be economically costly. Instead, if they have pressure to hide trade-offs, what they will say is, I'm in favor of climate policy because it will save the environment and it will create millions of new jobs across Europe, right? Or they will say the opposite. They might think, well, actually, I don't think this narrative is what voters will buy into. So instead, let me say I'm against climate policy. And what is the narrative that I'll support that position with? Well, it might be the opposite entangled narrative, which is that, don't worry about the environment. It's all going to be fine, or it's no issue at all. And if we did climate policy, it would be disastrous for the economy.
Yeah.
So just to finish why this matters, it matters because these entangled narratives, right, they support different policies under different conditions when compared to whatever the evidence-based narrative might be. And in particular, and that's what we show in the paper, it makes climate policy susceptible to shocks that actually do not change the environmental effects of climate policy, right? So if you have politicians who face incentives to hide trade-offs, and suddenly it becomes more costly economically to do climate policy, they might, well, in a world without entanglement, they would just say, it's become more costly to do climate policy, but still it's really important for the environment. And they might not shift their policy position. But in a world with entangled narratives, in a world with incentives to hide trade-offs, instead the politicians might shift their whole narrative bundle and say, well, voters no longer want to hear about the so-called economic benefits of climate policy because they won't.
Yeah.
So as a result, I also shift my environmental narratives. But that means that I no longer have the narratives to support climate policy, so I might shift my climate policy stance altogether.
Yeah, I think that's the thing I got is because you have these other dimensions, they can influence climate policy. Like in good times where, solar panels became a lot more cheaper, economic growth is good, it will boost the economic climate, it will boost the climate policy narratives. But in the bad times when you got a shock, and we'll talk about it in a second, that actually then makes climate policy take a further hit, which you call the accelerator in your paper. We get to. So then maybe let's talk about the data set, because I alluded to in the introduction. I think this is a really, I'm an economist. I like economic papers. I like data, and I think what you've done is really cool. So you study Europe and the Parliament specifically. Could you talk about kind of what you did to try to make this entanglement more, tangible?
Yes. So nothing I said so far is specific to Europe, of course, or indeed specific to climate policy. But we study the European Parliament for a few reasons specifically. The ninth European Parliament, which sat from 2019 till 2024. This is the parliament just before the current one. We study it firstly because this parliament had a big push to implement climate policy under what was called the European Green Deal. And in fact, my co-author, Luis Garicano, whom you already interviewed, he was part of that parliament for some years, and he very much was part of the drafting of some of these European Green Deal measures, including the CBAM, which I think you discussed with him, but also many other measures. So there was this huge push towards a European Green Deal in that parliament, which made it very interesting for us to study. And the second reason why we study this parliament and climate policy in particular is that Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. So in the middle of this parliament, which had a lot of different effects. But when it comes to climate policy, what it did is that it really hugely increased energy prices across Europe and beyond. But in Europe, it was particularly strongly felt. And many of us remember that time, of course. So it affected the economic costs of doing climate policy. But it didn't affect the laws of physics, which determine whether building wind turbines decreases CO2 emissions. So in a world without narrative entanglement, we would think that politicians change how they speak about the economic effects of climate policy, but they won't suddenly say that climate policy cannot mitigate climate change or is not necessary to mitigate climate change. Whereas in a world with narrative entanglement, we will see that politicians shift their whole narrative bundle. They don't only say that economic costs of climate policy have changed, but also the environmental. They will change their environmental stories about climate policy, which is why this offers us a sort of opportunity to study, to look for narrative entanglement in the data.
Yeah, and because exactly, you've got this really interesting case study, and then also just to shift over the period. So, we talk about entanglement, and then it's like, okay, how strong is it? Could you talk about kind of the empirical results you found in terms of like how strong entanglement is, even without this crisis, or
Right?
Because I was a little surprised seeing your results, but I'll leave that to you.
Yeah. So I should say more about how we even measure narratives, which is, can be a very vague concept.
Yeah.
In our theory, we try to make it very precise what a narrative is. And we basically describe a narrative as a subjective causal model. So a narrative tells you the causal effect of a policy across different outcomes, right? So a climate policy narrative tells you the environmental effects of the climate policy and the economic effects of the climate policy. So that's at least the theoretical object of narratives. And we can discuss whether or not that is a narrative. I think, it is a very broad description of narratives. It definitely doesn't get into the very interesting nitty-gritty details of what makes some narratives successful and not, what are the necessary elements of a narrative, etc.
Yeah.
But broadly speaking, it's a causal statement.
Yeah.
So that's a theoretical object. Empirically, we measure it by looking at all speeches made in the ninth European Parliament. Again, that was between 2019 and 2024. And this is just short of 50,000 speeches made over these 5 years. And there are many ways in which we could try to look at narratives. But what we chose to do, which is only recently possible, is to use large language models to try to draw out these causal statements. So what we do is we feed every single speech separately into a large language model. In our case, it's the GPT models by OpenAI. And we ask the model to draw out the causal narratives about how climate policy affects the environment, and also the causal narratives about how climate policy affects the economy. So that's what we do for climate policy, but I should add that our paper is broader. This is maybe beyond the scope of our talk here because we are focused on climate policy, but in our paper, we also look at other policy domains like immigration policy and digitization policy, both of which were very salient also during
Yeah.
the European Parliament. But by far the most salient, at least among these three, was indeed climate policy because of the European Green Deal and this push towards climate policy. So that was a huge, very big topic in the ninth European Parliament.
So it's like you get some speech, and then because of this large language model, it will say this is, well, it's climate is good for climate, and then also whether there was some statement pro or con what it's going to do to the economy, what it's going to do to the economy.
Exactly. And I should add here that we ask these questions in separate runs of the large language model, right? So each time we only give the large language model one speech and ask it to draw out one narrative statement in one dimension.
Okay, I
That's
see.
important because otherwise you may worry, as we did, that if you ask the large language model to classify each speech along all dimensions at the same time, then just by quote unquote trying, of course, the large language model
Yeah.
is not trying anything, but by trying to be consistent in its classification, it'll just say, it uses good narratives on all domains, or good
Yeah.
or bad narratives on all domains. So instead, we do it really separately. That increases the costs, but it's worth it, and it makes, I think, our results of narrative entanglement even more striking, which is so. Okay, just to continue with what we actually measure, we get at the speech level for each individual speech, we get a list of the narrative statements that the speech makes. And then we can look at entanglement either at the speech level or, of course, aggregated to whatever level you want. Let's say the member of the European Parliament level, the MEP level, or also the political group level. Just at the speech level, we already see huge amounts of huge signs of narrative entanglement. So the vast majority of speeches that discuss the economic and environmental effects of climate policy are entangled, so they don't discuss trade-offs. It's north of 90% of speeches, according to our current estimates. For immigration, it's even slightly larger. For us, this appears to be the most entangled policy domain across all domains.
Yeah.
When you aggregate this to the party level, then you see that parties sit in the corners. I mean that either the party group says, that climate policy is amazing for the environment and for the economy, or they sit in the opposite corner, that it's not necessary for an environment and really detrimental to the economy. So you see a real bifurcation of parties, and that's true also for other policy domains.
Yeah. I don't know if we can joke about it, but the economist quarter is kind of empty, where it's good for climate at very moderate cost for the economy, like the EU ETS. So the economist corner seems to be empty.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, so
So,
economists love to talk about trade-offs like, oh, this climate policy will, you know, maybe lead to some unemployment in this sector, but it'll, help some other people in that sector. Yeah, this is not what we find in a typical
yeah.
politician's speech.
And because sometimes I was wondering about this. Like, I rarely see trade-offs discussed. I'm like, why is that? And I think your paper also then shows it's not necessarily that they're not aware of the trade-offs. It's more like this is a narrative constructed because it's most appealing to voters. Like, it's coming from the voters, not from the politician. The politician is just maximizing his appeal to the base. So
Yeah.
could you then maybe, so we'll talk about Russia in a second and the invasion, but so you've established the entanglement is there, and then it's like part of your paper is like, why is that? Like, what's driving that? And I think that's a really cool part of your paper is it's coming kind of from like a demand from the voters, if I could call it that. I'm putting my own
Yeah.
words here, but
Yeah, no, exactly. So far we have mainly discussed the empirical aspect, but a big part of our paper is the theory behind narrative entanglement. Um, and absolutely, there is a demand side to it and a supply side to it, if you want to use the economist's jargon. But the demand side, the political demand side, is your aforementioned voters. The supply side is parties. In our case, we look at parties or politicians who care about being reelected. So that's how we think in this framework of politicians. They offer narratives and also their policy position in order to sort of maximize their electoral chances. And on the other side, you have voters who may have their own beliefs about how climate policy affects the environment and also the economy, but who also listen to politicians. They may or may not believe the politicians, but they
yeah.
hear what the politicians say about the effects of climate policy on the economy and the effects of climate policy on the environment. These are sort of the the narrative dimensions we look at. Although I should stress that in our model, there's nothing specific to climate. Our model is more general, right?
Yeah.
It's just about a policy and different dimensions of that policy. So you can think of climate, you can also think of, let's say, immigration. Immigration policy has economic effects, it has also cultural effects, which are now very saliently discussed among politicians. Or you can think of digitization policy and how that has economic effects and effects on security, etc. So nothing I'm saying is specific to climate policy. But anyway, so the question is then, where does this demand for entangled narratives come from, such that politicians want to supply entangled narratives? And I think the easiest way to explain that might be to start with a world where you would have no narrative entanglement at all.
Okay.
So let's start thinking about sort of an artificial little world where every single voter has some sort of belief about how climate policy affects different things. And every single voter only cares about the truth. And they can all tell whether politicians tell them something accurate narratives or not. And they only update their beliefs if politicians tell them something accurate.
Okay.
In such a world where this
It's
is
like perfect discernment. You can perfectly tell whether a politician is telling the truth or not. And you
exactly
only update when they're telling the truth. Yeah.
exactly. So let's just imagine this world
Yeah.
just to fix our ideas. So in such a world, if a politician uses an entangled narrative that's wrong, then voters will ignore them and stick with whatever they believe. So politicians might still not tell the truth, but then voters ignore them. Or politicians will tell something that is close to the truth or the truth, and then they will affect voter beliefs.
Yeah.
But in this world, entangled narratives don't really play much of a role. But now imagine that at least some voters, it doesn't have to be the majority of voters, but at least some voters function as follows. And I don't think that's completely crazy. They do care about climate policy, and they do care about whether climate policy helps the economy and whether climate policy helps the environment. but they don't really have the capacity to tell whether the politicians are telling the truth or not, or they don't have the time to spend a lot of time on these questions. But they still do take into account what politicians say, right? Or they
Yeah.
might choose to do so. They don't have to.
Yeah, they kind of read the news, but they don't verify the claims.
They don't verify every single claim, exactly. Or they look at social media,
Yeah.
right? Where, there is no sort of journalists
Yeah,
necessarily
just
check
clips. Yeah, exactly.
what is being said. So if a voter like this cannot tell what is the truth or not, what is going to be the driving force of whether they update their beliefs? Um, One very plausible, I think, or we think, driving force is something that's been long established in psychology, which is the tendency for motivated reasoning. So, motivated reasoning describes this idea that people, humans, when in doubt, often believe what makes them feel better about themselves. So, I think that's, a very, at least I think that's an uncontroversial statement, especially in cases where nailing the truth doesn't give you um, an immediate feedback,
Yeah.
or being wrong doesn't give you an immediate feedback, right? So,
Feedback and like feeling good
well,
or
in feeling good, but also when you're a voter and you're wrong about climate policy narratives of politicians, and as a result, you vote for the wrong politician, right? And then you find out, oh, it was wrong what they said. Their narratives are completely wrong. Well, because you're only one of, thousands or millions of voters, your mistake hasn't really
yeah.
changed the election anyway. So as a voter, you often have limited incentives to get every policy
Yeah.
narrative exactly right. Because even if you're wrong and on the basis of that elect the quote unquote wrong candidate, that
Yeah.
doesn't change the election outcome, right? So
Got it.
so there is not that much incentive to get it exactly right. At the same time, these policy questions are hugely complicated.
Of course, yeah.
So in such circumstances, where this feedback between being exactly right and your own circumstances is sort of limited, uh, we think it's reasonable to assume that at least some voters are motivated reasoners. So they'll
Yeah.
buy into the narrative that makes them feel good. And what makes them feel good will depend on their personal
Yeah.
circumstances, right? So somebody who loves big cars and drives around in a huge SUV, maybe that wouldn't make them feel very good to believe that it's terrible for the environment what they have to do and that they should pay way more taxes, right? So a voter like this would, through motivated reasoning, tend to not want to believe that,
Yeah.
opt for a different narrative. So motivated reasoning gives the demand for narratives that hide trade-offs,
Yeah.
because motivated reasoners, if they want to support climate policy, then they would prefer to believe that climate policy is great for the environment and it's going to be amazing for jobs. Whereas if they, for whatever reason, want to oppose climate policy, then they don't want to hear about the fact that this might be bad for an environment. They prefer to hear, that it's going to be fine with the environment, and
Yeah.
pursuing more aggressive climate policy would be very bad for the economy. That's what they would prefer to hear. So it is this sort of voter who
Yeah.
drives the demand for entangled narratives, and that also leads to the dynamic effects of narrative entanglement, which I discussed before, which is that even if only the economic costs of, say, climate policy change, politicians will feel pressure to change their entire narrative bundle about both the economic and environmental effects of climate policy. Because if they think that voters no longer buy into the economic benefits of climate policy, then it might be electorally more optimal
Mhm.
for them to switch their whole narrative bundle towards, let's not worry about the environment, it'll be fine. And it would cost us too much anyway to.
Yeah, because as you've got differences in economic costs, the distribution of voters will change. So some
Exactly.
politicians will also change because for them it's no longer optimal to
Exactly. But the key,
provide it in the positive way, but then they will switch.
exactly. And the key is that they will also adjust their environmental narrative, not only
Yeah,
economic narrative.
exactly.
That's why narrative entanglement really matters, because if politicians also change their environmental narrative, then this can accelerate policy shifts away from climate policy when you have an
Yeah.
increase in economic costs. And this is what at some point in the paper we call the narrative accelerator, which can operate in certain circumstances.
Awesome. Thanks for that. And then we can then I think that was a great bridge to then your case study of the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where you found like just this big economic shock. And
Yes,
then so you can start to look at what changes within politicians' narrative. So could you then kind of talk about, so you laid out the theory and narrative entanglement, what you then find after this economic shock?
exactly. So under the hypothesis that narrative entanglement operates, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which increased energy prices, you should see both shifts in economic narratives as well as shifts in environmental narratives. The latter would not be present if there were no entanglement. And this is exactly what we find. So, what we find after Russia's invasion of Ukraine is that politicians are much more likely, on average, to use the narrative that climate policy is detrimental to the economy. But also, they are much more likely to use the narrative that tighter climate policy is not necessary for the environment. So both of these go together, and the effects are very large. Um, a few additional points. One point is that we only look at the change for the same politicians. So we zoom in, we use politician fixed effects, meaning that we zoom in on individual politicians and see how they speak before versus after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And that's where we see these shifts, even accounting for that. Now we do see differences between politicians from left parties and politicians from right parties. And I was silent on this so far, but in our model, we also have a framework to think about this.
Okay.
And we also additionally model politicians' decision whether or not to speak on climate policy. Because, of course,
Yeah, that's the first stage decision. Do I speak
yeah,
on it? And then given that I speak, what do I tell?
absolutely. So we account for both of these things in our theoretical framework when we think about how to link our theory to the data. And our model predicts what we find. So what we find is that overall, it is right wing politicians who become much more likely to speak on the topic of climate change, of climate policy, sorry. And when they speak on it, they're much more likely to use the entangled narrative that climate policy is very bad for the economy and also doesn't help the environment. So overall, because the political right is much more likely to speak on it, and they use these negative entangled narratives. Overall, we see a shift towards more climate skeptic narratives. And
And-
our numbers are very, very large. So um, they don't sound large, maybe, but they are large. So for any given speech, the probability that that speech uses a climate skeptic narrative increases by almost 1 percentage point. But that's across all speeches in the entire European Parliament, not just speeches about climate. Right?
yeah.
And that's, I mean, compared to a baseline of just below 2%.
Okay, yeah.
1 percentage point increase compared to
That
2% of all speeches use a climate skeptic narrative. That's a huge effect, right? So voters are roughly 50% more likely to hear this narrative among speeches that are on the topic of climate.
and I think that's what gives this kind of volatile swing in narratives, like you say, because if there's a big economic shock, which it was,
Yeah,
then you also get a big swing in narrative.
exactly.
Because sometimes it's, even a lot of people like here suddenly hearing all these messages like, why is it suddenly shifted so much? And it's just like, first of all, it decides who speaks, and then when it speaks, there's the opposite nerve entanglement that gets highlighted. So,
Yeah,
and I was also wondering in your paper, because like you say, narrative entanglement naturally leads to narrative accelerator, where you get the shift both ways. Like it almost becomes like volatile, like an asset. It's not like a bond that it's more stable. That would, if I then hear it correctly, it's kind of like the interplay of forces between voters who want this motivated reasoning, they want to feel good, and then politicians kind of tailoring towards that. Is the How would you then kind of craft the narratives? Because I would imagine it seems hard to target the motivated reasoners themselves. Like, because I was thinking about your paper, to go in and change people's cost of searching on climate change is really hard. How would you then go about crafting more robust climate policy?
right. I think that's an excellent point, and I want to clarify one thing.
Yeah.
So it's a little more complicated than this because narrative entanglement can, as you just said, lead to what we call the narrative accelerator
Yeah.
and make things more volatile. But it can also lead to the opposite,
Okay.
which is to decelerate narrative and policy shift. And I think it's quite intuitive to think about it. So let's stick with climate policy again to fix ideas. In a world without entanglement, as economic costs of climate policy go up, the messages that politicians send about it would also smoothly go up with the cost,
Yeah.
right? If the costs become slightly higher, then politicians, if they acknowledge the truth and they know that, then they will also say, well, it's actually slightly higher than we thought. So it's sort of smooth. With entanglement, you have either a deceleration. Well, we have a deceleration in shifts for a while and then an abrupt acceleration. How it works is that, let's say economic costs go up a little bit, but you were firmly entrenched in the pro climate policy camp. Well, then, because you really want to stick to your environmental narrative and to supporting climate policy, then even as the economic costs go up, your economic narrative will be tied down by your environmental narrative. So you don't switch any of the narratives, right?
Yeah.
But then if economic costs go up sufficiently much, then the whole bundle will suddenly shift.
Yeah. Because it's discrete.
It's at this point where policy will shift as well. But ex ante, if you don't specify the sort of shocks you expect, it's not easy to say or not possible to say whether this leads to more volatility or less volatility.
Yeah, I see. Because if the shock is small enough, actually nothing will happen, and that's
Exactly.
like a kind of mitigating factor. It will decrease volatility. You're not shifting every time there's like some small shock to one of
Exactly.
them.
You're not shifting your narratives or your policy uh, in that world. But anyway, I want to go back to your other point still, which is how to craft narratives when there is narrative entanglement. And I think this is a really important but also very difficult
Yeah.
question because it is definitely, well, our paper is trying to describe things. It's definitely not advocating for narratives that are not evidence based. In fact, it's very dangerous for narratives and policy to depart from truthful communication for obvious reasons. Um, what we do want to highlight is that there is just this reality of entangled narratives. And climate policy advocates, when they craft their narratives and strategies, just have to take into account that there is this reality that political competition will often tend to produce these no trade-off
Yeah.
narratives, which you have to compete with. And I think another implication, if you believe in this notion of motivated reasoners, motivated reasoning among at least some voters, is that, well, if these voters want to adopt narratives that feel good to themselves, then it is important to craft narratives that do feel good. So
Yeah.
a narrative constantly just says that, everything will be terrible, but perhaps we can change a tiny, tiny bit and make it slightly less terrible. Then for motivated voters, this will sound differently to, we have a set of problems. There are really huge problems, but here are things that we can make better in our lives for the future.
Yeah.
So this might describe the same exact thing, but it will sound differently. And of course, there is a huge literature discussing these framing effects.
Yeah.
So that's not necessarily something new that comes out of our research, but I would say our research shows that there is this, it shows empirically that there is this fact of entangled narratives
Yeah.
that one has to contend with.
Thanks. I know it's always, hard to exactly suggest these things, but it's always nice too because you have thought about it. So maybe a question then that I don't think I sent you, but I'm always curious about: what surprised you during the process of writing this paper?
So many things. So firstly, I think in terms of the theory, it was just very nice to see how the process of writing down the theory and trying to work out the maths actually deepened our intuition in ways that we hadn't anticipated in advance. So I think one nice example of this is, and that wasn't obvious to me at all when I started writing the theory for this project, might be obvious to some other people, but not to me, is that it's not the case that narrative entanglement will vanish if most voters are quote unquote Bayesians. Bayesians meaning that they can detect if somebody tells the truth, and if the truth is spoken, then they will update their beliefs in terms of the truth. So it's not just the case that, politicians will match whatever is the majority of voters. Instead, even if the vast majority were Bayesian, and there's some amount of motivated reasoners, you might still only get entangled narrative and no politician might speak the truth. And it's quite obvious now to me why that's the case. But, just as an example, suppose that people who can tell whether somebody speaks the truth are already themselves quite close to the truth because they are interested in climate policy, etc. Well, then even if the vast majority of people are like that, the benefits for a politician to tell these people the truth might be limited because it doesn't change their beliefs very much. Whereas the benefits to these politicians from using entangled narratives for motivated reasoners might be very large. Of course, this abstracts from reputational costs where, you might lose some of the Bayesian voters if you speak untruths. But, I think it's still an interesting detail that I hadn't anticipated. So I guess, writing down the model, thinking through it, it wasn't the case that we already knew everything and just tried to put it into some sort of mathematical form. We actually, I think, learned many things about it. Also about the speech decision, etc. And then in terms of the empirics, it was just super interesting to see how large language models perform in terms of classifying narratives. And, we are not the only ones to do that right now. But when we started the project, we were among the, not the very first, but we were among the, first people who thought about how can we do this, how can we optimize it, and it wasn't obvious at all how it would perform at the start. But we think that it generates really, really interesting insights into, political narratives that we couldn't have without these large language models.
Yeah, I even see, I don't know, frontier of academics, but I see someone reading your paper like that's really cool, or then just looking at the data at other time periods of the European Parliament or other ways or other dimensions. So it's like a really, really nice data analytics. So
It's really easily reproducible because all you need is really the prompt, and then you need some money to do the thing, right?
exactly.
But once you have the prompts, more or less you have everything, and the data set, sure.
Yeah.
You can see for yourself, and you can extend it to other time periods. You can change the prompt any way you think makes more sense. See
Exactly.
if you can reproduce the results. Yeah, so I think it's a fascinating sphere to work in, these, trying to measure these narratives with large language models. And for sure there are some drawbacks, right? This is not an absolutely perfect tool. Just like, hiring research assistants and having them go through hundreds of
Exactly.
thousands of speeches is also not a perfect
That's true.
tool, but I think it's a very useful tool.
Exactly.
And we're still learning about it, and it's really a fascinating topic.
Cool. Then let me close out with this question. Is there anything we haven't covered about your paper that you would still like to highlight?
Yeah, so the main focus of our paper, I mean, it is called narrative entanglement. The main focus is narratives and speeches, but we do also care about policy. So what we do in the paper as well is we link these shifts in narratives that we estimate to shifts in legislative voting of the members of the European Parliament on climate policy issues. And we find a very, very strong connection between the two. So bigger shifts in narratives also corresponds to bigger shifts in voting on climate policy, right? So if you become more skeptic on the climate policy dimension in terms of narratives, then this is closely related to the voting patterns. This might not be super surprising in some way. Indeed, in our model, narratives and policies are jointly determined, of course, right? You're not going to use one set of narratives and then completely different
Yeah.
policy that doesn't fit with it. But I think it's interesting because, it tells us also that because they are related, we can learn about policy positions from looking at narratives. And, if voting on climate policy only happens X times per year, but speeches on climate policy happen all the time, then we have a more granular measure
Yeah.
of, narratives and policy jointly.
It's like a real time tracker. Yeah, like the 30-day moving average of climate positions will give you a very good update or
Yeah,
prediction. So
yeah. So because these things are jointly determined, then,
yeah.
even if we don't observe legislative voting, then we can infer the current positions from the narratives.
Yeah.
So I think that's another interesting
Yeah,
aspect.
and it's also the case. I already had Matilde Bombardini on U.S. climate policy, and she also mentioned the same thing, that is very
Yeah.
correlated. It's not like cheap talk where you
Yes,
say one thing but then you actually vote another. So
exactly. And they also look at both the demand and the supply side.
yeah,
Um, yeah, so that's very interesting.
awesome. Well, thank you so much on that. Am I really enjoyed this conversation? I think I am really looking forward to seeing more of this, because it's just like other episodes were more talking about climate policy kind of in as like designed by the politicians or the technocrats, but here it's like the real life, like how does it shift given to real life results, which then feeds into all the stuff you see on LinkedIn, because that's all the narrative stuff. So,
Right, right.
so I think this also might help make some economists make more sense out of the political discourse that they're seeing sometimes if they're a bit confused, which sometimes I am. And I've greatly benefited from this conversation. So thank you so much.
Yes, me too. It was a great pleasure. Thanks a lot for your time.